Hello, everyone. I am really delighted to introduce Dr. Sandra Smith as today's speaker. She is the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Carol Forsheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute, and Faculty Director of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management. Prior to that, she was chair and faculty member at UC Berkeley in sociology. Dr. Smith has published prolifically on topics related to urban poverty and joblessness, racial inequalities, social capital and networks, and the front end of criminal case processing, which includes pretrial detention and diversion. And that's the focus of today's talk. She has published 2 books, Lone Pursuit, Distrust and Defensive Individualism Among the Black Poor, and the Criminal Justice System as a Labor Market Institution. And she has a forthcoming book called The Cultural Logics of Job Matching Assistance. Her research on these topics is also published in a wide variety of journals, including the American Journal of Sociology, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, the Annual Review of Sociology, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Social Problems, Social Science Research, and a lot of other places. So Dr. Smith is also the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including the Laura and John Arnold Foundation grant and the Russell Sage Foundation Presidential Grant. So before I turn it over to Dr. Smith, I just want to remind the audience members that following the talk, there will be a Q&A period that will be facilitated by David Brady. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to submit questions throughout the talk, and do not use the chat feature. Other than that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Smith.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for that very extensive and generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Dave, I feel like it's been years since I've seen you. It's good to see you here. And I am glad to finally have this opportunity to speak to the Presley Center community. There was an invitation out for me to speak last year, but as we all know, all hell literally broke loose. And so we had to reschedule, but I'm certainly glad to be here today. So I'm going to start by saying the talk that I'm going to give today is based on some research that I've done just for this talk. I imagine that eventually I would have gotten around to it, but the question that Sharon posed was one that I actually hadn't been directly working on. And so I took this as and I figured I could have spoken about other things if I wanted to, but I took this as an opportunity to really think about the impact of fines and fees and other kind of collateral consequences of pretrial detention for this specific talk, and hopefully as time passes, incorporate it into the rest of the work that I'll be doing on the question of pretrial detention. I'm going to work now to share my screen. I'm not always the best at this, and so let's hope that I can do this successfully. Slideshow. Okay, so by now, it is well known that in the United States, 2.3 million individuals are incarcerated. On any given day of those incarcerated, roughly 30% are being held in our nation's local jails. Importantly, the majority of jails population or inhabitants, disproportionately Black and Latino, have not been convicted of the crime or crimes for which they've been held. Instead, over 60% are defendants awaiting case adjudication. Most are held because they cannot make bail. Pretrial detainees are often the poorest of the poor, arrested as much, if not more, for being offensive to the broader society than for having broken laws of any significance. Although most are released on the day of arraignment or within 1 week, the average stay is about 26 days. It is difficult to imagine how much damage just a few days in detention can do to the life of individuals and communities to which they belong. But recent research indicates that spending any more than 1 day in pretrial detention can have devastating consequences. We now know that pretrial detention can significantly increase individuals' likelihood of conviction on current charges. It can lead to more severe sentences with conviction. It can cause significant harm to an individual's psychological and physical well-being. It diminishes their labor market prospects, and it increases the financial burdens from legal fines and fees. Pretrial detention also significantly and substantially increases the likelihood of future penal system involvement. In other words, we are creating recidivists out of people who, if not for detention, likely would not have further contact with law enforcement. It is safe to say that pretrial detention has produced far greater costs to our society than benefits to public safety. I should note that the larger project that this particular talk and paper will be a part of tackles this issue head on, the question of the role that pretrial detention plays in increasing the likelihood of future criminal legal system involvement. The Difference a Day Makes, which is the title of the book project, is a study about what it is about being detained for any more than 1 to 2 days that significantly alters individuals' penal trajectories. Today, however, my focus will be on the potential consequences of pretrial detention for mobility trajectories. So here I'm going to draw from some fairly recent work that links pretrial detention with research that allows the researchers to make causal claims about the impact that pretrial detention has. One of the most recent studies to speak to this issue directly, and then I think relates to the topic that we'll be having today, the discussion we'll be having today, is Dobie Golden and Yang's 2018 paper. Here, they're looking at the effect of pretrial detention on a whole host of factors using very sophisticated methodology that allows them to really kind of identify and the impact specifically that pretrial detention has, and specifically on marginal released defendants or marginal defendants, whether released or not. And what they find is that there's an 11.3 percentage points increase for those who have been released as opposed to those who are held. In terms of the income that they have 2 years after the bail hearing. So they're more likely to be working, and the income that they earn is 11.3% higher. They earn on average $1,000 extra per year. They're 10.2 percentage points more likely to file a tax return. And they're also more likely to be in receipt of EITC benefits on the order of about $200 per year. So with this in mind, it had me thinking, and we all already know the impact that having contact with the criminal justice system in general has on individuals' employment outcomes. This particular study and a few others got me thinking about what the trajectories of individuals who've had pretrial detention or have experienced pretrial detention. What kind of mobility trajectories can we expect for people who have this kind of experience? And it had me thinking about the data that I've been collecting, qualitative, which you'll learn much more about. And I recalled differences in the kinds of experiences that people seem to have contingent on the kind of financial stability in their lives, to what extent they were working and to what extent they were engaged in work that would allow them a certain kind of economic stability. And what was interesting to me when thinking about it, just based on some, random files that I would read, was that those who had some measure of resources also suffered after having pretrial detention experiences, but their suffering was quite a bit different than the suffering of those who were at the very low end of our economic spectrum. And so this opportunity to speak to you today is an opportunity that I'm taking advantage of in order to kind of sort through what is happening to individuals, what kinds of trajectories emerge as a result of pretrial detention experience, and how that differs across the respondents in my sample. And so I ask, what impact does pretrial detention have on individuals' mobility trajectories? Now, for those of you who are quantitatively inclined, you might be troubled by my use of the term mobility trajectory, since I won't be adopting the kind of or using the kind of data that is typically associated with this kind of analysis. But the data that I do have allows me to track where individuals are in terms of various aspects of their experience that speaks to how well, how stable, how secure they are are after contact with the penal system, after pretrial detention. And so in addition to asking what impact does pretrial detention have on individuals' mobility trajectories, I'm also interested in the mechanisms through which these trajectories are altered over time. So let me say a few words about my data and analytic approach. I use in-depth semi-structured interviews for the San Francisco part of my data set. There are 191 individuals, ethno-racially diverse men and women. These data were collected in 2016 to 2019. It's a convenience sample. We recruited from San Francisco Pretrial Diversion Project. They have a couple of programs. It's basic pretrial diversion program, but also its neighborhood court program. From both programs, you have access to only low risk, low level defendants who are diverted to these programs. You could only be low risk and low level in order to be diverted to these programs. Arrests and related charges are dismissed after program completion. So these are folks who will not have these on their record after they've successfully completed the program. Respondents were interviewed roughly 3 years after the arrest that led to their participation in San Francisco pretrial diversion. And that becomes important. That is important in part because if you want to say anything about whether or not people recidivate, it makes sense to wait at least 3 years, because within that period of time, the overwhelming majority of folks who would have done so, who will do so, will have done so by then. But it also then becomes important for me to be able to suss out how their social and economic circumstances have changed over time. And that becomes important in terms of making sense of their trajectories. So again, I suggested this is a part of a larger project. The broader project is a 4-city study of pretrial detention and diversion. My team and I conducted in-depth interviews in Chicago, Houston, and Louisville. We also collected took a whole bunch of field notes in the context of Louisville's Metro Correction. So we were in the context of the jail as people were being booked in, and we used the time that we were there to recruit, to also collect or just make systematic observations about the space, the comings and goings, the set of interactions, etc. And so for the broader project, the observations too will speak to the findings that we report. With regards to the San Francisco part of the study, respondents were queried about their personal background, social and institutional affiliations, the extent and nature of their substance use and mental health issues, their arrest, detention, and diversion histories and experiences, the perceptions about the legitimacy of legal authorities, post-release reintegration experiences. This includes housing issues, employment issues, issues related to debt associated with fines and fees, et cetera. We asked these questions too with regards to the other samples, the other cities as well. In terms of coding, we organized a 5-member coding team and adopted both a deductive and an inductive approach to our coding. Each transcript was read by 2 coders to ensure intercoder reliability. And in terms of how we're going to make sense of the findings that I'm going to report today, I investigated post-detention changes in individuals' socioeconomic status related to their circumstances, with a focus on the sources of their financial support, their work stability, and the housing quality and stability over this period of time. These factors have been found to be incredibly important in terms of making sense of whether or not people end up engaging in end up having future contact with the criminal legal system, as well as a host of other factors. And so I focus on those issues. All studies have their limitations. Mine would be that it's a relatively small, non-representative sample. I would put an asterisk there for qualitative study. It's not that small at all. But for major projects, generally speaking, a sample of this size would be considered small. There's a reliance on retrospective accounts and self-reports of criminal record and activity. Mostly that becomes an issue because of memory. People don't always remember the specifics or details about their experiences from the past. And that could be from a week out to certainly the 3 years that we're looking here. And so there might be some recall issues. And then there are issues with regards to how comfortable people are to speak about aspects of their behavior that the broader society might find troubling. I'm not sure that this ended up being a problem given the kinds of experiences and behaviors people were willing to share, but it is worth noting that that's a possibility, especially since I could not and would not do the work of confirming some of the things that my respondents told me. And then with this kind of study, there's an inability to make causal arguments or claims. And so what I'm suggesting is a set of relationships that we should investigate further in future research. But with this kind of study, there are a whole host of gains that we have as well. They're the detailed descriptions of individuals' experiences in jail, despite the fact that there's just been an amazing body of research on contact with the criminal legal system over the past 3 decades. There have been relatively few studies of people who experienced jail and on the experience of jail itself. So this represents an important contribution in that way. The study will also help us to better understand the processes linking jail-related experiences with future criminal legal system contact, and that is what I hope my next book will be about. This kind of study will also allow us to see the meanings that offenders attach to the fact of their criminal justice system contact and how they frame these events. Very few studies have this kind of data, which will enable us to understand patterns of behavior that directly result, at least in part, from individuals' way of seeing the world. And what this kind of work allows is a set of new or confirmatory insights into potentially important variables that we can then use to frame hypotheses for quantitative research. Let's talk about these mobility trajectories. There are essentially 3 that I've identified. With I do have one caveat to this. It's the delayed mobility, it's deteriorated mobility, and there's the shackled. And so I'll talk about each. Actually, I'll talk about each in a little bit. First, let me share with you a bit about the sample. Not surprisingly, predominantly male, but a higher percentage of women are in the sample than we would expect in the broader population. Folks who've had this kind of criminal legal system contact. The sample is almost evenly distributed among Blacks, Latinos, and whites, with proportionally fewer Asians and multiracial individuals. Mostly folks have a high school diploma or some college, with a quarter of the population saying that the sample saying that they have a college degree or more. In terms of support, over half claimed support exclusively from the jobs that they held. But a number also reported support exclusively from government programs. And as you can see, a significant minority, about 25%, indicated that they survived by drawing from multiple sources of support. So it might be jobs and government programs, might be government programs and family members, it might be illegal income, etc. So they were really culling from various sources in order to make ends meet. The majority of the sample, however, and not surprisingly, we're on the low end of the income spectrum. 30% reported household earnings or household income of 30%, and another almost 30% reported household income between 20,000 and 39,000. So well over half were making below 40,000. Their household was bringing in more or less than 40,000. Is that right? Yeah, less than 40,000. From the coding that my coding team did, we were able to identify the various kind of consequences that individuals felt resulted specifically from pretrial detention. And I say that because individuals have contact with police beforehand, they experience interactions in the courts, and then for those who go on to experiencing punishment through incarceration or probation, they're having interactions there too. We specifically asked individuals about the impact that pretrial detention had on them, what kinds of consequences that were borne by the fact that they spent this time behind bars. over a third said that debt accumulation resulted from this experience, that they had to carry this debt and figure out ways to pay it off if possible. And that was a big hit. Relatively few people mentioned being late on rent or missing rent, losing custody of children, losing housing, license, money, etc. Really the big factors, the big consequences that many of my respondents seem to suffer was around amassing this debt. It was also around missing work, and then a number experienced negative mental health consequences associated with this experience of pretrial detention. At some point, we can talk about what pretrial detention was like for many of my respondents that were produced this kind of effect. Although for those of us who've been paying any attention to what's been written in the media and the number of studies that are coming out, there have been hints about what this experience is like that would probably give us some sense. So in terms of these mobility trajectories, what essentially, the majority of my sample, at least, pretrial detention appears to not have had basically very little impact on their social and economic health and well-being. There's no movement in terms of their relationship with work. There's no movement with regards to their relationship to housing or housing stability. There's no movement in terms of their ability to support themselves. So thinking in terms of the work situation, the financial support situation, generally speaking, and the housing situation. For most, they kept, once they were released, they kept going on in their lives. There wasn't any major hurdle. But for a significant minority of my respondents, pretrial detention was associated with significant changes in their well-being. But the changes that occurred differed depending on the kinds of respondents that we were talking about and to. There was one group that I would call as having a kind of delayed mobility. These were folks who were moving right along. They were making fairly decent money, middle class, lower middle class, making decent money. These are people who then had something to lose with pretrial detention. They were often the folks who were hit with the kinds of financial burdens with debt, such that it caused them to defer plans and really try to figure out how to get themselves out of the hole that was created as a result of their pretrial detention experiences. And after a couple of years, and in this case about 3, they were able to work themselves to a place where they were back where they were before. So this kind of sidetracked them in a way. So their mobility was stalled until they were able to get themselves out of this hole, and then they kept going. Then there are the folks that I call those who did experience a kind of deteriorated set of circumstances. By and large, these people were working class folks or the working poor. Pretrial detention for them had a hugely negative impact on their housing situation. It affected their employment prospects. Many lost jobs. And it also had an impact on the kinds of support that they were able to garner in order to make ends meet above and beyond income from work. And so their experiences were a deterioration. And over the 3-year period that we were looking at them, the deterioration continued. There's no evidence of movement upward yet. Otherwise, we would have placed them in a category of delayed mobility, and it was unclear how they were going to get themselves to a better place or to where they were before they had contact with the criminal legal system and experienced pretrial detention specifically. And then the third population of folks, the third category includes people who were already down and out, right? These are folks who are essentially kind of the truly disadvantaged. And so what detention did for them is not so much lead to a set of losses because they had so little to lose. Many in this category were people who were homeless. They didn't have work and probably hadn't worked for some time. They lacked good connections with other people, conventional others. So they didn't have a lot to lose. They didn't have much property, etc. But what pretrial detention did for these folks was to in some way block opportunities that sometimes emerged that they could have taken advantage of and in order to maybe lift themselves out of the lowest of rungs. And so what I want to do next is to share with you the stories or experiences of a set of folks whose whose experiences are consistent with these categories I've come up with. Just to give you a sense, though, of how I've been thinking about this, I really looked at the changes that occurred in individuals' financial support, their work situation, and housing. I did this by examining what people said their situation was immediately after they were released from detention, and then 3 years later, and really kind of paid attention to the change, if at all, in their circumstances. And so, as you can see, the panel that includes the good, no change, these are folks who were basically primarily relying on their own work. They were relying on their own, the income from their jobs. They were living in their own home or the home of a family member, and fairly consistently. And they were also folks who were employed. And see, these were folks for whom there was consistency between these two periods. And so we imagine that the stability for these folks means that pretrial detention, while disruptive, perhaps in some ways, did not fundamentally alter their trajectories in any way. And here, I would suggest that over a half of my respondents fall into this category. They experienced pretrial detention, but they were able to keep going. It didn't really change their trajectories too much. Then we have the folks whose trajectories were impacted significantly, but over the 3-year period from the point of detention, they essentially worked their way out of it. So they found themselves amassed in debt, and they worked themselves out of the debt to a place where they felt like they could manage themselves financially. They often didn't have a job at the point where they were released and were working by the time that we found them. And in some cases, the folks were living with family members or friends or other non-relatives, or they were staying in hotels, shelters, etc. In some cases, a few were homeless. We see the movement for these folks to better housing situations, something far more stable, often living either with family members in a stable way, or they were able to find their own housing. They were able to live in their own house or apartment. So we describe the situation as improving over this period of time, and we call these people those who had kind of a delayed mobility. These were often the people who were doing okay, and then this situation really put them in a hole that they were able to climb out of. The bad, no change, these are really the truly disadvantaged, who I describe as kind of being shackled to the bottom because of, at least in part, because of the contact that they have with the criminal legal system, and the kind of contact that makes it so that any opportunities that they might have to get some foothold in a life that they might describe as more stable, more secure, their contact with the criminal legal system ended up blocking that. So these people I have described as being shackled to the bottom. And then finally, the folks whose situation worsened over this period of time. Immediately after detention, things weren't so bad, but we see their circumstances declining such that they're no longer able to rely on income from jobs. They're much more likely to be relying on government assistance or some combination in order to make ends meet. And their work situation has been altered in some way. They're no longer working by the time we interviewed them, despite the fact that they were working immediately after pretrial detention. And then there are the folks who have lost stable, secure housing, and so are struggling either by moving around to various locations or in hotels, transitional housing, or homeless in some cases. These are the folks that I have described as having deteriorated circumstances. And these are the folks, so it's each of these categories, especially the three on the right, that I will be focusing my attention on. So the first respondent that I would like to introduce you to is a fellow I'm going to call Jason Lamb. Jason was 25 years old, male, from Pennsylvania native, of Asian descent. He was a fairly young, no children. He had 2 vocational certificates from community college. When we interviewed him, he was working full-time in multiple jobs, and was able to, as a result of these jobs, earn between $50,000 and $60,000 per year. Jason had one arrest, spent less than a day in pretrial detention, and no convictions from the arrest that he had. Jason's experience is interesting because it showcases how individuals who might be doing perfectly fine in their lives, moving along without much trouble, have an experience with the criminal legal system that fundamentally changes their trajectory in some real way. Jason describes his experience in pretrial detention in this very way. He was a part of a small group that hung out in a park, and they would enact scenes with weapons that were fairly theatrical in nature. He described going to various stores to be able to buy these, and so they would play out these fights in the context of a park. After one of these events, his friends dropped him at a bus stop. He takes the bus home, and he's walking from the bus stop to his house. He's stopped by the police, who want to know about the weapon that he has on him. It's a dirk or a dagger, as he describes it, but it's a prop. It's a prop sword. And so there's nothing truly dangerous about this. He tries to explain this to the police officers, but they were having none of it. He makes the comment that they must have thought that he was some kind of Japanese or Chinese gangster, is how he described it. They profiled me, said I was a gangster, told me to freeze. They took me to North Beach Station, and at the station they were busy looking up the law because they weren't actually sure he should have been held or arrested for carrying this weapon. So they bring him in, they lock him up, and he's waiting to hear what's going to happen with his case. He calls a few people after learning that they will be holding him over for a few days. He doesn't want any of this. He decides to bail himself out immediately, pays about $4,000 to do so. Ends up adding a few extra $1,000 when he hires an attorney who gets the case dismissed. And then he has some other expenses that are related to pretrial, which end up totaling about $7,500, all told, because of this arrest that led to his detention that he wanted to avoid, etc. And so Jason was pretty clear that his circumstances, his life trajectory had been changed by this experience. He felt like he was doing well. He was making moves to get more education. He was trying to expand on kind of a business that he had. He had money saved so that he can engage in some of these ventures. But this experience meant that he no longer had the resources available to invest in himself, to invest in his business. He says, so basically, I think the reason why I haven't already achieved this position is because of the trauma that the experience has caused me. I've lost $6,500 having to fight this case, and I put that on my credit cards. I really nicked my credit score. It really limited both my film aspirations and animation aspirations. So that was $6,500 I had planned to run a third consecutive film festival in a row. I couldn't do it because all the money was tied to this case. And after I won it, the money still doesn't come back to me. And secondly, that really put a lot of stress on me because I had to worry about repaying debt. And lastly, but not least, for certain high-ranking banker positions, you have to have a certain kind of credit score in order for them to hire you. So my credit score is good now, I think, but still having that nick from 2014 really put a damper on my aspirations. I mean, think about it. With that much money, I could have qualified for a down payment for a home. So I really think the finances and stress brought on by the experience, brought by the harrowing experience. So the rest really, the detention, I should call it, really set my plans back by 2 or 3 years. He sees this experience, which, is in some ways kind of shocking because of its nature. As the experience that fundamentally changed his trajectory for at least a few years. He's worked towards building or getting himself out of debt that he found himself in because of this experience, but still felt like he had lost 2 to 3 years in terms of fulfilling his goals. this is what and so Jason is fairly typical of those that we categorize as having a kind of delayed mobility. They felt like they were on their way to doing things. They were really excited about the future. This contact with the criminal legal system happens. In some cases, it's for offenses that end up getting thrown out. In other cases, not. No matter what, though, it ends up having some leveling effect in terms of their ability to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. They end up getting out of it and eventually moving forward, but it takes a few years. To do so. And at each point, I'm going to have to remind you that this is happening to people who've not been convicted of the crimes. And in this case, this wasn't a crime for which they have been brought in. And so we see with those who describe their lives in such a way that I would label it delayed mobility, the collateral consequences that they most often described having were having amassed a whole heap of debt related to their cases. In many cases, this was a result of having to pay to get out of detention because they didn't want to stay in detention for very long. I remember another respondent who had gone into pretrial detention accused of actually assaulting an officer, which he denied. He was drunk and had made a mistake and walked into a crime scene. Police officers became upset with him, jumped him, beat him up, put him in jail, where he was threatened by the corrections officers, et cetera, goes on. But this becomes important because he too knew he was going to be sitting in jail for a good number of days, waiting case adjudication. But because he was feeling threatened all around him, he decided it made more sense to just put the money up for bail and lose that if necessary, so that he wouldn't have to deal with the potential consequences of staying in jail for another couple of days. Those who I described as having delayed mobility also reported negative educational impact. In some cases, people had to end their coursework, drop out of programs that they were in order because of the detention specifically that they experienced. Negative employment impact, and this is above and beyond losing a job. These are the folks who felt like they had been stigmatized by their employers for having been detained, and so it ended up having an impact on how folks interacted with them in the workplace. Negative mental, physical health impact, and also the impact it had on their mental health and emotional well-being. In terms of the deteriorated consequences, here I want to share with you the experiences very briefly of Maria Consuelo. She's 35 years old, a Berkeley native, Latina. She had one son who was 4.5 years old when I interviewed her. High school diploma. Although she now relies solely on government assistance, before contact that led to her detention, she was working in customer service and hospitality in the specific job that these are the kinds of jobs she tended to have. The specific job that she had when she had been arrested and then eventually lost because of being held in jail was one with the city and county of San Francisco. She was a clerical assistant. So she lost that job as a result of being detained. She had been arrested for DUIs, public intoxication, a weapons possession charge, because she was holding on to, she had in her possession the gun of a boyfriend. If the cops seemed to know that the gun belonged to him, she refused to say it was his because she knew that if she did, he would have a 25-year sentence. So she took the hit herself. The case ended up being dismissed eventually. Her luck would have it, but it was the thing that she had been arrested for. And she'd been detained 5 times for a total of 22 days by the time that I met up with her to interview her. And so the case that put her on my radar was where she had been driving drunk and had gotten into an accident. As a result of this, she was brought to jail and held there for 4 days. because she was in detention for 4 days and her employer did not know where she was, they called this a no-show and ended up firing her. She did ask her brother to call her employer, but everything that she had was on her cell phone. And she didn't remember any of the numbers associated with her workplace, as many of us do not do these days. And so she asked him to call. He could not identify who he was supposed to call, so he never got in touch with them. They assumed that she was no-show, and after the 4 days, they fired her. So as a result of this experience in detention, she not only lost her job, she also lost access to her housing situation. Her financial situation shifted, so she was no longer relying on income from employment. She was now relying on government assistance. Her housing situation also changed. She went from being in her own apartment to being in transitional housing as in an effort to kind of reduce the negative impact of this the record that she had developed because of this particular charge. She was waiting in transitional housing for Section 8 housing to open up for herself. So here we see someone who had been, despite the alcohol addiction, who had been taking care of herself, taking care of her son through work. Otherwise, besides the frequent DUIs, seemed to be able to manage her affairs. In fact, she described herself as a functional drunk. This situation, and specifically the tension associated with it, she describes as creating a kind of domino effect. She loses the job, she ends up losing her housing, she has to shift to public assistance, and she's not quite sure how she's going to be able to make ends meet. And so when I met her, she was in the process of still trying to figure out how to recover from the consequences of the arrest and detention that resulted because of the most recent DUI and accident. Like Consuelo, like Maria, other folks who are in this circumstance listed lost opportunities, deferred plans as major kind of collateral consequences of pretrial detention. They lost custody. In fact, Maria lost custody of her son, who was then sent to foster care for about 4 months before her mother was able to get custody of him and take care of him. When I met her, her mother was still the primary custodian of her son. Lost housing, again, as Maria did, a job, other kinds of property. Often when people are held in detention and then released, they're given back the property they came in with. Many times the property that they came in with does not go out with them. People have reported phones being missing, lost, money being missing, lost, etc. So lost property is most often referring to the losses that result when people leave detention without the items that they came in to detention with. And then the negative impact on their educational aspirations. And then finally, I want to introduce you to Kevin Basa, a young man that I have categorized as being shackled to the bottom. So many interviewed for this project were desperate for release from pretrial detention. Kevin wasn't so pressed. He didn't have anywhere to go. He was no one on the outside was waiting for him. His family had all but given up on him. And they neither expected nor wanted to hear from him. He had alienated them so much. They certainly would not bail him out. He had few friends, and those who he did have were tied up with their own lives, he said. He had no pets to feed, no home to go back to. He was homeless. He was unhoused. There was no work to miss because he didn't have a job or no classes to make up. So there was no rush for Kevin to be released from pretrial detention. His downward spiral happened 4 years before. The 37-year-old San Francisco native of Pacific Island descent was unemployed and relying on government assistance to get by. 3 years before, he had spent 3 weeks in pretrial detention. before being released on his own recognizance. Since then, he had been arrested almost 24 times. Almost all of these arrests were related to the bench warrants that judges issued because Kevin routinely failed to attend scheduled court hearings, something that is fairly typical for those who are unhoused. It is very difficult to remember and get needed information about your court hearings if you do not have an address where folks can send mail to you. So his life began to fall apart when he experienced two major losses. He moved from his hometown into his pregnant girlfriend's brother's apartment in the suburbs. He found a job and they tried to make a life together. Not long after, though, he lost this job. The business that employed him failed and closed its doors. He struggled to find a new job. This created tension between him and his partner. They ended up breaking up. He went back to his own parents' home in San Francisco, but got into frequent quarrels with his siblings, which led to an altercation and then a fire in the house. I don't want to get into great details, but what he describes is as drama-filled as it seems. At this point, he's feeling completely alienated from everyone, and so decides that he wants to be close to his son, the son that he had with the ex-girlfriend. So he goes back to the suburban community where they live, but he doesn't have a place to stay. He ends up being homeless. A friend tells him about a car that he had stolen and that was lying somewhere in some street, and said, if you go to it, you could use the car to get around if you need to, which he did. And he did that for 1 week. He acted like the car was his own. He cleaned it. He, filled it up with gas. Of events where he was arrested multiple times, a couple of dozen times, for these bench warrants. And by the time this begins to happen, this 37-year-old man from San Francisco is now homeless. He is without a job. He has no true deep connections anymore. He has very little to hold on to. And so he's basically living on the streets. And it turns out that by living on the streets, he's essentially putting himself in a situation where the police are constantly aware of his existence. And so they keep stopping him, right? He's eating his lunch on the sidewalk. They stop him. And so he reports that his failure to attend court hearings and to fulfill other obligations to the court led to numerous bench warrants. Whenever they happened upon him on the street, police had cause to arrest him. But according to Kevin, there were two reasons why officers would engage him at all. The first, according to him, was that they were racially profiling him. Kevin believed he fit some description. Second, because he had been arrested before, officers recognized him. And so they would stop him and frisk him whenever they saw him, knowing that he'd had contact in the past. So given that he was homeless, this happened pretty often. He reports, after the first arrest, they know who I am. Now that I'm on probation, now I would understand a little bit more, but since they knew who I am, the first time they would get me. And I just feel like right there, it's just taking, just because they knew who I am, they're going to stop me. If they see me, then they stop me. Like I said earlier, I was just sitting there having a sandwich and coffee, and this officer stops. He turns around and notices who I am, and I'm not doing anything wrong. And so I'm going to write your name in just because I know who you are. And so he's describing his typical experiences and getting very frustrated by it. Here, what we observe is what some describe as the stickiness of the system. Once individuals have made contact, the system holds on, almost insisting on continued engagement, even in cases where such engagement might not have been warranted. By frequently stopping him and frisking Kevin, police were able to find drugs on his person. One such stop led to an arrest and his second conviction for drug possession. Once he became homeless, he used drugs daily to cope with his feelings of depression and anxiety. But the overwhelming majority of these arrests led to pretrial detention without conviction, without anything to follow it up. So this had implications, though, for Kevin's ability to get back on his feet. So for Kevin, pretrial detention was less of a concern because he was being confined. Being in detention wasn't worse than living on the streets. Instead, more than once, the incapacitation essentially disrupted his plans for social and economic recovery. Indeed, despite having so little to lose, Kevin actually lost quite a bit because of detention. And these losses had the effect of knocking him back down every time he attempted to lift himself up. He offered a few examples. On one occasion, he was repairing a truck that his cousin had given him to help him get back on his feet. The truck starter was failing, and so Kevin was attempting to repair it while it was parked on the street in a crosswalk. The police officers drove by and told him to move the vehicle. The starter was broken, so he couldn't move the vehicle. Officers stopped again, ran his name, and discovered that he had a bench warrant. They pulled their guns on him. They arrested him. Kevin did not want them to tow his truck, and so they asked the officers to allow him to contact a friend who lived just around the corner. Just let me contact him so that he can come and take the truck. I don't want to lose the truck. But the officers accused him of lying, and they refused this request. Instead, they had the truck towed, and it was in the lot the whole time he was in detention, which meant that the costs associated with holding the truck just accumulated. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, upon release, Kevin lacked the money to recover the truck. He was, again, homeless, without work, etc. And so he lost it. He was devastated, and finding that the officers' actions were gratuitous. I just feel that was wrong of them to do this, he said, even though with the warrant, they just wanted to take it from me just because. Upon leaving detention on another occasion, he realized that his property was missing. To be more accurate, jail staff had lost it. This included items in his backpack, a cell phone, etc. So basically, I left jail in some flip-flops and an oversized shirt because they had somehow lost his other clothes and some of the items that he would need in order to get by. And then finally, he mentions a situation where he had a job interview. Kevin, he lost this job opportunity during another stint in detention, the result of the arrest arising from another bench warrant. I don't know, maybe it's the string of luck, but I know I had a job. I had a job interview the day I got arrested. And then when I finally got out of jail 3 weeks later, I learned that they called me back for a second interview. But he was away in jail, so he never got that call. And I was like, and that was a job I really wanted to get to. These encounters, essentially, then with law enforcement, left and the time he's spending in detention left Kevin demoralized. Every time he thought he was making strides towards getting back on his feet, the system intervened and pulled him back down. It sucks, he said. That was a major responsibility, just kept pulling me down or pushing me down. He said, I'm going to give you one final quote before moving away from Kevin's story. He said, I just feel like I just got robbed by the police. I just got robbed by the county. You know what I mean? I felt like they robbed me bad, especially as low as I am right now. At the low point in my life right now, they took from me, and there's nothing. I can't do nothing about it. You know what I mean? Can't do nothing about it. Oh, well, too bad. You had a warrant. What goes with that? Wow. That's some bullshit, really. Come on now. It's okay for them to just do that. And that's not cool. That's not cool. That's not cool at all. I feel like the system is pulling me down. I don't know why. And so we see with this case, a case of a man who finds himself in the system. He's struggling mightily on a number of levels. initially unrelated to his criminal legal system contact. But once the system gets hold of Kevin, there's a way in which it engages with him such that it makes it almost impossible for him to find his way back to where he was before, which wasn't necessarily an amazing place, but it was far more stable and secure than the homelessness, the unemployment that he had found himself in over the past 3+ years. And so we describe this, or I describe this, as being shackled to the bottom. This man, Kevin, was already doing very poorly. The detention, the contact with the criminal legal system just ended up helping to shackle him down to the bottom, because of the persistent way in which they engaged him, often in ways that blocked him from being able to take advantage of the few opportunities that emerged for him. And so shackled to the bottom is how we describe this. Here we see that the collateral consequences associated with those who are shackled to the bottom are, they report as lost custody of their children, lost housing, lost property, and negative mental and physical health impact. You'll notice that no one's mentioning lost jobs. This is a population that was, by and large, they had very low levels of employment, so they weren't losing work as a result of this kind of contact and the kind of other consequences that are associated with having work. These were not people who missed work. They didn't lose the job, etc. But they did lose housing. They lost property, as you noted within Kevin's case, and they also often would lose custody of their, often enough would lose custody of their children. I'll wrap up now. Some summary and conclusion. There's a growing body of research that's focusing on the social costs of contact with the criminal legal system. It's a really interesting and important body of research that's emerging. I see this as falling in general in this category of scholarship. Pretrial detention, we're learning more and more, has detrimental impacts in a whole host of ways. What I'm suggesting here is that it also has an impact on individuals' mobility trajectories, shaping for people who, I have to repeat, have not been convicted of the crimes for which they are being held, leads for some, and those who tend to have a few more resources, to delayed mobility. For others who are working poor or lower working class, it deteriorates their circumstances to the point where it basically kind of knocks them down to the truly disadvantaged category. And those who are already in the truly disadvantaged category are those who get essentially shackled to the bottom because this contact, and specifically issues related to detention, end up blocking any opportunities they have for achieving any kind of measure of mobility out of this the lowest rung of the socioeconomic hierarchy. I could go into a bit more discussion about the costs associated with pretrial detention, highlighting the factors or the cost to individuals that previous research has identified, and suggesting we actually need to pay attention to a few more things because we've not really thought much about how costs are associated with the trajectories that people have. But I won't, because we're running out of time. And then I'll suggest that, this is a system that we know increasingly does far more harm than good. And it does require a great deal of reform, if not fundamental transformation or alteration of this particular system. We can do so by reducing arrests, especially for crimes that are truly much more offensive in character than they are criminal. Eliminate cash bail could go a long way. Provide greater support of pretrial defense to those who are poor, like Kevin, and for pretrial detainees who are frequent users of the system, provide the social services that they need to address the problems that lead to their continued penal system contact. I will end there. Apologies for going long.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I am going to moderate the Q&A, and people can post questions into the Q&A little interface there at the bottom of the screen. I'll go ahead and screen that for you, Sandra. I'll just read the first question because this is the nature of this asymmetrical webinar format. But since the first question is from Sharon, do you want to just go ahead and ask it out loud, Sharon?
Sure. Yeah, really interesting talk here. Sandra, I actually had I have a million questions, but I won't take up all the time. So really quickly, I have two questions that come to mind, and I'd like to know your thoughts on those. The first is, what role, if any, does stigma play in terms of affecting the consequences for these folks? So you talk about like financial and other types of consequences. So, but is there stigma effects on just having pretrial detention in terms of social or other kinds of ways for these individuals? And then my second question is, did you notice any that the length of time that they're, I think earlier on you said one study found about the average pretrial detention was 26 days. So did you notice that the length of time really matters in terms of exacerbating these consequences for folks?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. I'll take the last question first. So the book project itself looks at the impact of spending, each day in pretrial detention up to 7-8 days, and that's in part because a lot of the damage that gets done happens in that first week, and the consequences, the negative consequences, the collateral consequences begin to accumulate within the first day, and certainly by the full first day in detention, you start to see really negative outcomes, an accumulation of material losses. People do start to lose the cars, lose access to housing. And of course, the debt starts to accumulate almost as soon as you have contact with the criminal legal system. And so, and as the days progress, there are other kinds of poor outcomes that emerge. There's greater distance with your family members and some friends on the outside. And as you lose touch with them, you end up relying much more heavily on other inmates in order, just to get through the day, for information, for advice on how to deal with the criminal legal system, for how to get resources in the jail. You come to rely on other inmates a lot for those reasons. That is made all the more the case because the staff in jails tend to be so unhelpful, and often in ways that are rude, demeaning. So inmates learn pretty quickly that they cannot rely on guards for that kind of assistance. And if they ask too much, it can often lead to violence. And so we see a shift in who they end up relying on in terms of their social bonds away from family towards folks in the jail, in such a way that if they came in thinking they're very different from these people, for those who stay in longer, they end up leaving feeling like I'm not that different from them. These are people who are like me. They're suffering from very similar things. There's an impact on their social, emotional health and well-being. We see by day 4 constant references to complete and utter misery. There's also an impact on health and well-being, at least in part because you're in an environment that is incredibly boring, right? There's absolutely nothing to do in jail, but you have to be always attentive to the possibility of violence or other things erupting in the most unpredictable ways. And so it creates this space where you're both not quite with it, but you have to be attentive. I had some respondents reporting that they didn't sleep at night because they didn't trust that they wouldn't be assaulted. And so they would stay awake the whole night and maybe get 3 hours or so of sleep during the daytime. So there are a whole host of issues, of consequences associated with pretrial detention that we should be paying a lot of attention to, and that increases with every day. That is what I found most striking. I mean, it's the reason why I wanted to do this study, that one day could make such a difference. And so within that first week, those days, there's an accumulation of these material and non-material losses. There's an accumulation or there's that strain in conventional ties, and a kind of growing strength with the ties with those who are also experiencing the criminal legal system in this way. There's also a growing kind of legal cynicism. People are noticing how the corrections officers are treating people. They've already experienced the police, and in a lot of cases, people felt that experience was deeply problematic, unfair, fair. So they're developing a deep and abiding kind of cynicism towards legal authorities, including authorities who are watching them daily, and to the system, generally speaking. So we see this kind of increase over this period of time. The book is primarily about that move through those days and the kinds of consequences that are associated with each of them. So that's the first question. The second, that's the second question. The first question was about stigma. I'm not sure if you're asking if they felt stigmatized, generally speaking, or to what extent stigma affected the trajectories. It seemed, so yes, people did feel stigmatized. I think how their family members and friends dealt with it, to the extent that they knew, if people were able to avoid telling their family members and friends, they often wouldn't. They would do whatever, especially, and this was possible if you could get out of jail within the first day. You wouldn't have to, and you had the resources to get yourself out. You would never have to tell people. And so we have a number of respondents who didn't say anything, and months later they might have revealed it. In some cases, not at all, and that was the intention. And that is driven by the sense that they will be stigmatized. And then for others, they need their family members and friends for various reasons. How those people deal with their detention is what shapes how they come to look at it. Some people are very open and extraordinarily helpful. It helps to strengthen those ties when they are that way. And people end up not, that was a bad point in my life, whatever, I got through it. And so it ends in that way. It doesn't become like deep in terms of their sense of themselves. But for those who are responded to by their families and members and friends, by their employers in a very negative way, that taint, that smell stays with them. And so it then begins to shape how they engage with multiple institutions. I have one man who didn't feel comfortable marrying his fiance anymore, didn't feel comfortable with his employment relationship because he felt like he had been stained by his experience in pretrial detention. Felt like the stigma was so great that it was going to impact how people dealt with him. And there's a way that he responded, assuming the stigma, and then creating some distance between himself and others in his life. So I will leave it there, but stigma, yes, and certainly every day within the first week and beyond make a difference, but it's striking how much change happens over that first week.
Okay, I'll just go through the queue of questions here, Sandra. The next question is, do you think that there's a difference in pretrial detentions between different states and even counties? That is, what have you noticed from your approaches towards it in California versus, say, Texas, or any notable examples, perhaps?
Well, I haven't gotten a chance to do the analysis of the data from Chicago, Louisville, or Houston yet. So, which is why in part I didn't speak to it now. We've yet to incorporate that into this broader question. The reason why I wanted to do a study that looked across sites is because I do expect that there are going to be some differences. These states differ significantly in terms of the severity of the penal systems, how punitive they are. They also vary significantly in their processes. And to some extent, although this is changing now, they vary in terms of the extent to which they hold people pre-trial and what it takes for folks to get out. I say that the variation is declining because Houston, San Francisco have engaged in pretrial reform to reduce their numbers, in part because there was litigation. Chicago has recently also engaged in pretrial reform. In all cases, it should reduce their jail populations significantly. So it makes it so they're a bit more similar than they were before. But my expectation is that will be different. I wasn't in any way impressed by what San Francisco is doing, but San Francisco is likely the most progressive of these cities. And so I'm really interested in how different the experiences are. I can't wait to be in a place where I can share with you what those differences are.
Okay, and I forgot to read the person's name last time, so I'll read it this time. Arleth Flores Aparicio raises, she says, thank you for your presentation. In the research, did you notice that the people who suffered the most from mental health was in the shackled category? How did these people cope with their mental health, if they could at all? If they could cope with mental health, did they try reaching out to government social services?
I'm sorry, remind me the first name again?
Arleth.
Arleth. So, the category that experienced potentially experienced the most harm and maybe was the most vulnerable was not necessarily those who had mental health issues alone, the category that comes up as having the most issues are those who are struggling both with mental health issues and substance abuse issues. These folks with co-occurring disorders, they occur in my sample at a much higher rate. Many people think that a high percentage of those who are in our nation's jails who have substance abuse issues likely also have mental health issues, and vice versa. They just have not done a good job of capturing it. So we're talking about a population that is struggling with both. These are the folks who are most likely to experience violence at the hands of police when they come into contact with them. And they also report, although I've not had a chance to dig deep into this with regards to this particular paper, report more difficult experiences as well in the context of detention. So I would suggest that we think about those with co-occurring disorders, because my research and what I've learned since indicates that that's the population that in some ways has the worst outcomes. Even if you were to compare them, for instance, to differences across race, folks with co-occurring disorders have worse outcomes than Black folks, Latino folks. It's quite remarkable. So I would point to that as an important category to pay attention to.
Okay, I'll ask the next question. So Sandra wrote this amazing chapter for a volume we edited. It's the best paper, in my opinion, ever written on social networks and racial inequalities in the labor market. And in that chapter, like, you gave us such a just big picture perspective, not just about the subject, but how to understand the subject as part of broader systems of inequality. So I wanted to ask you, just as an off the cuff, totally big picture, totally just so we can exploit this opportunity. How do you think about criminal justice and pretrial specifically as part of this much bigger complex of racist institutions in America? I mean, I just honestly would like to hear you riff about how do we, I mean, what is its magnitude relative to everything else? How do you think about it relative to your work on employment and labor markets? How do we situate this in substance and significance relative to the broader complex of racist institutions? Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying. So my response to that is that I see the criminal legal system, the penal system, as an institution of not just racial domination, but class domination, the combined. I see this as an institution that was built up, expanded after the 1960s in order to address our society's major social problems. And so I will point out this happened after a decade where there was all sorts of social upheaval, much of it, frankly, related not just to civil rights issues, but also economic rights issues, people wanting access to better employment, et cetera. And so it led to a whole host of movements. It led to a lot of disenfranchised, economically, socially disenfranchised young Black people hitting the streets to push for greater access to opportunities. This for them was more than about civil rights. It was about having access to what it would take to thrive. And so our government, our state responded to this by expanding the penal apparatus. This was essentially both an issue of race and continued racial domination. How dare these people hit the streets demanding more? But it was also an issue of class. We were entering a period where there was a decline in access to good paying jobs for working class people, right? Their deindustrialization was already underway by the end of the 1960s and was already beginning to affect the employment of folks who were deeply engaged in that kind of work. Black men were disproportionately employed in this sector. As those jobs were going, there was nothing really much to replace it. So we have a shift in the structure of the economy that reduces opportunities to employment for people with low levels of skill and low levels of education. That corresponds with these other movements. Our state, the federal government, could have responded by amping up the welfare state. This is what other advanced economies did. States with advanced economies did. They built up their welfare state in order to support those who were struggling at the bottom. Our state responded with this penal apparatus, and as a result, started to warehouse people. They felt like we're at greatest risk of creating the kind of social disorder, social upheavals in the street that we saw in the 1960s. I think that is the core, and have continued to do so. I mean, I think that there are a number of other factors that have emerged over the past 3 to 4 decades that continue to explain mass incarceration. The tough on crime rhetoric that was really about getting into office, a whole bunch of other factors that we can point to, but it emerges during this period of time of upheaval. Black folks really kind of trying to push not just for civil rights, economic rights, during a period where there are many fewer jobs for people who had their skill set. The response by our state was this. I think it might have been a somewhat different response had those been white people pushing for those kinds of changes, as we've seen in prior eras, or at least one prior era. So that's how I tend to understand this issue, the situation. Pretrial detention is a part of that. The solution to our problem of folks who primarily on the low end, how do you contain this population? Pretrial detention enables you to do that, enables you to kind of grab up a whole bunch of people who are struggling at the bottom and be able to again control and contain them in ways that allow you to feel like you're managing this population, what John Irwin calls the rabble.
We'll take one last question here. I was going to say, I've got it from Tanya here, and it's as a follow-up to the earlier question about differences between sites. Do you anticipate finding differences? How or why did you pick these specific sites?
I think I answered the first question, so I'll answer the second one, and maybe that'll give time for another person.
Okay.
I wanted to be able to identify places in different parts of the country that I thought had different kinds of, well, to be honest with you, histories of race, histories of the use of the criminal legal system, because I thought that would likely have informed policies, incarceration policies, generally speaking, and policies in terms of how to deal with the overflow of people in our nation's jails, which started to become a problem very clearly in the 1980s and 90s. Cities were starting to address it by engaging, developing these programs, diversion programs, et cetera, ways to get people out quickly from the system, even while stamping them so they knew who they were. And so my thinking was that by looking at different regions of the country, it might map onto different ways, different types of engagement with penal methods and different histories of race, which I think are connected, at least in this country, with the use of different penal methods.
Okay, I think we can squeeze one more in. I'm just going to exploit Sandra being so nice. Based on your research and others you cite, what policy recommendations might you advocate for? This is from Allison Monterosa, pardon me. There is a lot of discussion about prison abolition, alternative modes of policing, and defunding the police. Would you please speak to some of these ideas? And do you think these are viable policy recommendations?
Viable. I wouldn't stop myself from making recommendations based on whether or not they're viable, because what might not be viable today might be viable tomorrow. So earlier, or at the end of my talk, I suggested that the issue here is with the pretrial detention system as a part of a broader, very problematic system. And so I think that I would get as close to abolition as I could with regards to pretrial detention. We have seen some cities do this without any negative effects to public safety. So for instance, for the past 30 years, Washington, D.C. essentially lets go 90% of the folks that they arrest. And when I say let go, it's not like they can get just they give them a court date and they expect them to come back to court on their court date so that they can finish the process, the adjudication process. And the overwhelming majority of people do that. They go to court, they go to their court hearings, and the overwhelming majority stay out of trouble. They're not committing new offenses. And so my thinking is we've seen models that work where we don't have to, given the great number of costs that are associated with pretrial detention, both to the individuals, their families and communities, but also to the system. Why are we holding on to these people when the benefits seem to be relatively nil? We can release people and not have to worry about public safety. We can release people and not have to worry about them coming back. So let's bring down the numbers significantly. A number of jurisdictions are already in the process of doing that. Some before COVID, a little bit. COVID has quickened the pace, at least with regards to pretrial detention, with no, again, impacts on public safety. So first, I think that we need to stop arresting people for stupid, silly offenses. And we actually see with the emergence of these progressive prosecutors, these people who are at least saying that they won't prosecute people who are brought in on fairly minor offenses, nonviolent misdemeanors, nonviolent felonies, that they won't even prosecute, they're just gonna let them go. So I think we can reduce the number of people that we arrest so that they don't end up in the system. We can also engage in elimination of cash bail. That would go that should go a long way towards significantly reducing the number of people that we hold. I think how much of a reduction depends on what kind of risk assessment tool each of these jurisdictions uses, and they use different ones, but it should still have some major hit in terms of the population. I think that we should invest a lot more in the defense of especially poor people when they are being held pretrial. We know from recent work out of San Francisco, established this program where they essentially provided defense to poor people who were being held on whatever charges. They focused on felonies because they didn't have that many resources. And what they found is that they were able to double the number of people that they released because the defense would often find evidence that disputed the reason why the person was arrested. Like, it was a whole host of things. It provided the kind of support that, people who with money, who can buy an attorney often get. And what that meant was a significant reduction in those who were held. So pretrial defense, I think even as we expanded our penal system and threw lots of money into personnel related to police officers, the courts to some extent, not maybe a ton, and building prisons, we didn't really do much, if anything, to build up the budget for public defenders. That needs to change. And then finally, we need to invest in programs that will deal with our frequent users. These are people who suffer from often, again, mental health and substance abuse issues. People are unhoused. They end up cycling in and out of jails, hospitals, and shelters constantly. This is, if you were to identify those people and give them the help that they needed, you'd probably reduce daily admissions rates substantially. But that is also a reflection of the state investing far more in criminal legal system than investing in the kinds of social and medical services that our people need. So that's what I would do to start. There are other recommendations I could make, but we have limited time.
Okay. In fact, we are out of time. So let me thank you, Sandra. This is a super interesting lecture. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And I'll go ahead and end the session. And thank you again.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Thanks,
Sandra. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Sharon.